Hi, and welcome back to week 3 of English 2. Hopefully at this point you have now read Elizabeth Bishop's One Art. It's not a long poem. And we're now ready to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's going on in it and to kind of get some of the ideas across figure out what this poem is trying to do. So, first of all, let's go with that understanding level of close reading. So, what is actually being said here? We can go through it paragraph by paragraph, but most of our paragraphs tend to come across the same idea, because the same idea, in fact, the same words, get repeated a lot. Specifically, the idea that the art of losing isn't hard to master, and the idea that losing something isn't a disaster. So our first stanza, pretty straightforward. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. It's not hard to get good at losing things. Some things are practically losing themselves. It's not a disaster. Seems like a pretty straightforward opening. Paragraph 2, or stanza 2. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Again, seems reasonable. Lose door keys. Everyone's done that probably at some point. Everyone's wasted an hour of time. Saying lose something every day. It's not hard to get good at this. Stanza 3. Then practice losing farther, losing faster. Places and names and where it was you meant to go, meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. So here things seem a little different. We're taking a bit of a shift in that these are not concrete things like the door keys or the hour. How do you lose a place? How do you lose a name? How do you lose wherever it was that you meant to travel? It's definitely a different kind of loss that we're talking about here than being unable to find your keys. But the main message here is still the same. Losing these things will not be a disaster. Stanza 4. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last, or next to last, of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So we're back to actual things being lost. But, again, these are a different kind of things than door keys or... Like, if you lose your mother's watch, you've either lost someone else's possessions or you've lost, like, your own heirloom. How do you lose a house? Generally we think the ways you can lose a house are not particularly good. It's not ideal. So these are pretty big things, presumably. But we're still ending with that same idea. The art of losing isn't hard to master. It's not hard to get good at this. Stanza 5. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. So we're back to losing things that you wouldn't think you could lose. Like, how do you lose a city? How do you lose realms, rivers, continents? How do you have a continent in the first place to lose? So what does she mean by this? Or, I guess we don't necessarily know the gender of our narrator. What does our author, Bishop, mean by this? But again, same idea. I missed these things, but it wasn't a disaster. And then we have our final stanza, stanza 6. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing is not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. So here again we have, for the first time, not a thing, not an abstract idea, but a person. Then we have, for the first time, a direct address to a you. And what we know about this you is presumably it is a loved one. Like the joking voice, a gesture I love. And this person says, even losing you, I won't have lied. Still not too hard to get good at losing, even though it may look like disaster. But we also have some interesting things that we might not quite know what to do with. Specifically, in our last line, we have that little interjection in parentheses, 2 words, write it, where our author seems to be telling someone to write something. Question is, who is our writer addressing? Well, given that we know of exactly one person who's writing, it's probably herself, or the narrator is addressing themselves. And why is that there? It might not immediately make sense. So maybe we'll look at some other stuff and see if that helps us figure some of it out. So now we've done our surface reading. Surface sort of form. Obviously we have rhyme here. And obviously this is a pretty kind of set rhyme scheme. Like, we keep having the same sounds appear over and over. So that aster sound, that aster rhyme, and that ent rhyme. So for the first, we have master, disaster, fluster, faster, laster, vaster, gesture. So we have a lot of words using that same rhyme, a lot of lines using that same rhyme. In fact, some of them even repeat the same word. I only read master and disaster once, but they're in there a lot. So one thing to notice with that is that there are a couple of those rhymes that aren't quite as rhymey as the others. So master, disaster, faster, vaster, these are what we call perfect rhymes. They're like an exact rhyme. Master and disaster and fluster and gesture, it's kind of a rhyme. Like, you can see where that would come from, why you might think it's a rhyme. But it's also kind of not. This is what we call a slant rhyme or a near rhyme, because it's like a rhyme but slightly slanted. Or it's near a rhyme but it's not actually a rhyme. And that's something that we'll probably want to return to, because those tend to have an effect when we read them. So we've got a couple things in mind to return to. The write it, the slant rhymes or near rhymes. And then we have, specifically, this is a very, very set format. If you notice, there are only 2 rhyme sounds. Our first and last stanzas have both master and disaster in them. In fact, the same line, pretty much. The art of losing is not too hard to master. And then something not being a disaster. And then every stanza in between has one of those 2 lines. That is, in fact, the criteria for a particular kind of poem called a villanelle, which is a poem with only 2 rhyme sounds. The first and third lines of that first stanza, that first group of lines, are rhyming refrains. So those sentences or lines get repeated at the end of each successive stanza, and then are put together into 2 successive rhyming lines at the very end of the poem in a couplet. So, what is a villanelle, and why does it matter that one art is one? And what light might that shed on our poem? Well, first of all, you can help us think about what a villanelle is. You've probably never heard of this poem before, but you've almost certainly heard of the word that it's based on, which is also a word in English. And that word is villain. Now, you might think, oh, is this something like this is a poem about a female villain? No. This is specifically not the way we use villain nowadays. It's the way villain tended to be used, 500 years ago, which specifically referred to, peasants. And I'll leave it to you on your own time to think about how messed up it is in our world that our word for peasant became also our word for villain, for, a bad person, an antagonist, a horrible, awful person is a villain. But when this poetic form was created, it was because folks wanted to write poems about peasants, about the common people. Of course, one thing the common people at the time really didn't have much time for was really fancy poetry. Like, they were too busy, like making sure their sheep didn't die, or like farming crops. And so this is not a poem written by peasants. It's poems written about peasants by people who are very much not peasants. And it tends to be often associated with pastoral imagery, which is, again, this idea of like this very idealized version of country life and the peaceful ways in which like shepherd boys and shepherd girls would, like have romances and like hang out with their fluffy sheep and, have picnics and the like. Obviously, any of you who have ever taken care of sheep know that is probably not quite how it goes. Like, your average person taking care of a sheep is not dressed like Little Bo Peep, who is a great example of a pastoral image. That's where she comes from. Because, like, big poofy skirts, not super practical if you, like, are running around in mud and sheep shit. So, Little Bo Peep has very little to do with anyone who actually took care of sheep. Little Bo Peep is there as sort of a wealthy, privileged person's idea of what it must have been like to be a shepherdess, with no actual experience or thought about, like, yeah, it's kind of a let them eat cake kind of idea. And Villanelle was very much that kind of poem. Often it's used for lighthearted and simple themes or topics, like romance or like heartwarming friendship between, like, a peasant and their faithful dog or something. And it's kind of fallen out of favor a little as well because, A, we tend not to think so much about peasants anymore, and B, because it tended to be seen as not a super serious kind of form. So, what might it mean for this poem that Elizabeth Bishop, our author, chooses to write it in this form that is specifically associated with like kind of lighthearted and simple themes or topics, which, like, attitude, completely regardless of attitude, this poem is about losing things, including losing big things, which is not a super cheerful topic. And why use this poem that tends to be associated with, like, rich people writing about poor people in the way that makes it clear they know nothing about poor people? Why might she have used that form for this poem? So those may or may not change the way you think about the poem, but certainly things to keep in mind since, again, we've looked at this form. It does not happen by accident. Like, you don't accidentally write a villanelle. Bishop wanted to make this a villanelle. So, why does that matter? Certainly, it sets up a particular kind of rhyme scheme. One of the things about villanelles is because they have those repeated lines, not only does that set up a very repetitive rhyme scheme, but it also means you're coming back to the same ideas over and over. It's kind of a cycle, a circle, sort of. It's like a circle of life. And what it tends to mean is that those lines that get repeated a lot. And what happens when we repeat things? When we repeat things, one thing, we remember them better. Repetition tends to help with, like, rote memorization. The more times we hear something, the more likely we are to know what it's saying off the top of our head, we are to remember it. The other thing that repetition can kind of sometimes cause is doubt. Ironically, it can make us remember things better and drive them home better, but it can also make us wonder about them in ways we didn't before. Let's say you have a friend, and you ask them how they're doing, and they say, "I'm fine." "No, really, I'm fine." "No, seriously, I'm fine." The first time you probably go, "Sure, okay, they're fine." By the third time you're like, "Is everything okay?" Because you're saying you're fine, but you're saying it a lot. The Shakespearean equivalent of this is the famous line, "Methinks my lady doth protest too much." If you're saying things so often, who are you trying to convince? So we have a lot of lines that are repeated in this poem. Specifically, that line, "The art of losing isn't hard to master," and the idea of something not being disaster. So what does it mean that those are repeated? That we remember those lines better? That we maybe doubt their sincerity? How would those things make us think differently of the poem? And then, obviously, we have, again, that write it at the end. When do we tell ourselves to do something? Why would you tell yourself, write it? The same way you say, eat your vegetables. In general, it's because we're trying to get ourselves to do something that we don't want to do or aren't particularly willing to do. Whether that's because it's unpleasant, whether it's because it's difficult, whether it's because we just don't want to do it. But in general, that's when we tend to kind of have to command ourselves to do things. If it's something that we don't really feel inclined to do. So why might our author be telling herself, write it in that last line? How might that make us think differently of the poem? So what I'd like you to do, with all these things that kind of I've brought up in mind, and anything else that you may have noticed, because certainly there's a lot more going on in this poem than I have time for in, a fairly semi-short video. It's probably going to be close to 20 minutes, but okay. Then what I'd like you to do is go to our discussion post, which will be up when this video is, and I'd like you to kind of answer specifically a few questions. Do we think what that surface reading of the poem is correct? Is our author really saying, losing things, you'll get good at it, it's no big deal? And why or why not? Why might we agree with that idea, or why not? What other things might we point to? I'd also like you to think a little bit about that write it at the end. What is our author trying to do with that little interjection? So what I'd like you to do is post your thoughts on that to Blackboard discussion board. It's going to be a post first thing, basically. So since we're all looking at the same poem, you'll post your thoughts, and then once you posted yours, you'll be able to see the thoughts that other people have left. And then once you have posted and you've written what you thought about the poem, then I would like you to watch the next video, which is a clip of the Hollywood film In Her Shoes, in which we have a character, Maggie, played by Cameron Diaz, who is reading and interpreting this particular poem as part of that film. So there's a little bit of background to kind of make it make sense. This film is about two sisters and their mother, and Cameron Diaz's character is, at this point in the movie, somewhat estranged from her sister. They've had a big fight, they're not talking, and the woman who we sometimes see intercut with her interpretation of the poem is, in fact, her sister. So I'd like you to watch that video, pay attention to the version of the poem we see and to Maggie's interpretation of it. And then I'd like you to return for our next video, in which we'll play a game. Are you better interpreting literature than Cameron Diaz? So look forward to that, and I'll see you in a bit. Bye.